on with any of this. Okay, so as we go through this, what we're going to do is kind of do a brief agenda here, kind of walk through some of this financial analysis, ratio analysis type things that happen with higher education clients. The topics we're going to cover are these, some general comments, and then we've just picked select areas that ratios can help you monitor, specifically for higher education clients and things of that sort. And then again, we'll kind of give you some examples that we actually present. Some of you may recognize some of the data that we present as samples as we walk through these slides. The general comments we wanted to make just to kind of start this off is, I don't know how many of you, I know our clients use ratio analysis. Those of you who are not our clients, I don't know how much you get into ratios. The point we want to make with this and just general comments is that they can be very useful in just helping you not only tell your story, pointing out strengths and challenges your organization may face, and then also what others may see, rating agencies, others that pick up your financial statements. If you haven't already calculated these ratios, they're going to calculate them. And you may get questions about that. And if you have no clue what they're even talking about on the ratio, it's a little hard to explain why that ratio is what it is, especially the trend of that ratio. It also helps in strategic planning and what those decisions will do. Am I echoing a little bit? Let me move this down some. It feels like I'm echoing. And it'll also help you decide, okay, we made this strategic decision. What do we expect to see happen? If somewhere along that line you start seeing it's not doing what you anticipated, you might course correct. So it can help you in those ways. Again, we've picked some ratios here. Your individual organizations need to decide what are those ratios that are key for you. What is helping you tell your story? What do you need to track? What are your concern areas? What are the positives? Whatever it may be, and then track those ratios along with your strategic plan and make sure that the decisions you're making are sending you in the direction that you thought it was going to send you. So first big broad category we're looking at here is just simply your resource efficiency and flexibility. So you operate, you have what we would call in the not-for-profit world your net assets sitting there, specifically your expendable net assets, and you kind of compare those to different things and decide, are we in a good place with our financial resources, our expendable resources? The ratio we'll talk about here is called the primary reserve ratio. Those of you, again, that we work with, you've heard this because a million times, we talk about it all the time. It's a core ratio of the composite financial index, which we'll talk about near the end of our presentation. And so what does this ratio do? What's the intent of this ratio? What does it mean? Well, it's designed to measure how long, theoretically, your institution could continue to operate if you ceased receiving any inflow. So based on theoretically, the expendable resources you already have in-house, how long could you continue to operate? This is a ratio I use with other clients that aren't in higher education. The benchmarks are different. We say here the minimum advisable is 0.4. That's in the higher education realm. I tell you, I work with some foundations that ratio is more like 4 and 5, 6, 7, that type of thing. So again, because of who they are and how they operate, it's just a different indicator that they're using, but it does the same thing. Theoretically, how long could you operate? The calculation, expendable net assets divided by operating expenses. Pretty simple. Seems like it. The expendable net assets is the piece that, and it'll come up with another ratio later, so I'll go ahead and define it now. If you're looking at your statement of financial position, your expendable net assets are simply defined as your unrestricted and temporarily. It's just easier to use the old language, so I'm going to use the old language. Unrestricted and temporarily restricted, exclusive of any plant-related net assets, because you typically don't spend your buildings. So anything that's sitting in net assets related to plant. So for example, one that's often missed when we first start working with a client, you have significant pledges that are restricted for buildings. Operational type pledges that are out there in your restricted net assets are fine. That's expendable net assets. You're going to get those at some point. If they're ultimately going into plant, you're never going to be able to just spend those. So you don't get to count those as expendable net assets. So again, that's the way that works. Now this is what it looks like, for example, when we do a presentation to a client. We'll show this trend and say, well, where are you? This particular institution, without you guys knowing anything about who this is, what would you think their position is with regards to their expendable net assets? You think they've got a decent position? Or do you think they're limited on their expendable net assets? Oh, sure. The red bar here is just their 5-year average. The green is the minimum advisable. And then the yellow is our median group of our group from the previous year, where they all fall.
And then the actual ratios for the institution.
Right. So if you can't read the numbers, it's a 1.85. Their average for the 5 years is a 1.4. We've already said it's a 0.4 is the minimum advisable. And let me explain the 0.4. That's 0.4 of 12 months. So that's 5 months. So the authors of this, the Strategic Financial Analysis book that's been out for years, Ron Saluzzo and Phil Tahey, they're the ones that have defined this. And in doing their analysis, a 0.4 is kind of the minimum point where they would think you're financially healthy on this ratio. So 5 months. So the point is, looking at this trend, you can kind of see, okay, it fluctuates, but it looks like that relative to their operating expenses, they're in a decent place. Debt management, another broad area you can look at with ratios. First one we'll look at viability, and of course the reason for that is it's part of the CFI again, that composite financial index. It feeds into that number. And then we've got a couple others there that we'll take a look at when we go into this. So much the same way as the primary reserve ratio compared operating expenses to expendable net assets, this ratio is taking those same expendable net assets and comparing them to your debt. This theory is that if you stopped, again, you had to stop operation, pay off your debt. Maybe you don't stop operations, but you just have to pay off debt. Theoretically, could you do that with expendable net assets? And I'm saying theoretically because obviously some of those restricted net assets you may not be able to use to pay off debt. But again, it's a theoretical thing. These are resources that are available. And could you retire your debt? Expendable net assets divided by debt, minimum advisable 1.25 to 2. So you would have more expendable net assets than you do debt. And if you think about that, even if you're in the for-profit world, you're really kind of looking at what's your equity versus your debt if you leave out that permanently restricted stuff that you can never spend anyway. Again, this is the trend of this particular example that you would see. So it's interesting. Another point I want to point out, and John, add any other color you want to add as we go through this. But if you notice this pattern, let's go back to your primary reserve ratio. Oops. Sort of a similar pattern right there. So are you starting to, without, oh, let me go back. Don't want to do my poll yet. This thing is tricky. Okay, there we go. Now I feel bad that I was having a hard time understanding why people were having a hard time with the clicker earlier. Now I'm appreciating it. You see a similar pattern, and if you look at the calculation, both of these ratios, primary reserve and this one, are based on expendable net assets. So you're starting to form a story that, okay, there's been some fluctuation in their net assets, but they look to be in a decent position with their expendable net assets compared to debt and operating expenses. So far, looking pretty good. You then go on to the first poll question. Now, this is a very important question that you need to answer because I lost on this question in San Antonio when we shared this as part of our booth. John won, I lost based on it. There's an answer to this. Yes, I would agree. It's just not the answer he thinks it is. Oh, no. No. Mark down the peoples that are answering yes, because we've got to dock some CPE. I mean, Bruce Willis was in an interview and specifically said it is not a Christmas movie. Bruce Willis from himself said that. So anyway, so John, you're still winning on that one. I still have not won one.
You know, the other thing about both the primary reserve and the viability ratio, it's based on expendable net assets. And you saw how there was a spike in 21 from 20. Well, a big part, especially if you have a sizable endowment, a big part of your expendable net assets is the unspent appreciation on the endowment. So if you have a good return year of the investments, the investment markets are doing really well, then you should see an uptick in your expendable net assets, resulting in a boost to both your primary reserve ratio and your viability ratio. So it's important to understand what's causing that to go up. It might be due to some strategic or management decisions, but in the case of 21, a lot of that had to do with because the market returns were so good, and it really, your unspent appreciation on your endowment.
Good point. So when we've done presentations this year, we're kind of setting the expectation for this upcoming year by pointing out to the boards that, look, this is a lot of this is driven by what the markets have been doing. And if they don't continue in this realm, don't be surprised if these ratios drop back some. It doesn't mean you change something and you're doing something wrong. It's just a big part of those, as John said, are made up of these investment returns that are fluctuating. All right, debt burden ratio. This is another ratio that the strategic financial analysis folks are looking at, and the idea of this one is measuring your debt service compared to your total expenditures that are going out the door, plus your principal payments on your debt. So in essence, your operations, how much are being financed by debt relative to each other. And the minimum advisable on that is less than 7%. And as you can see, the calculation, principal payments plus interest, total expenses, get rid of depreciation, the large non-cash thing, and then add your principal payments. And that's what you would want to look at. And again, less than 7 is where you would want that to be. A lot of ours struggle with this one. And this is one that in particular, I want to make sure I stress. You have to understand this ratio. If you're sharing this ratio with board members and others, you have to make sure they understand the ratio, because we can all do math, right? And if you look at the calculation of this ratio and you solely wanted to drive this ratio down, what's the easiest thing you could do? Just increase all of your other expenses. And all of a sudden, this ratio looks great. Was that a good financial decision? Probably not, but you could drive this ratio to make it look pretty good. So you have to understand your institution, and yes, the recommended level of the authors is less than 7. You need to look at your own institution and decide where are you based on how you're having to finance your operations, whether it's through equity or debt, and what is reasonable for you. And you track based on your strategic plan where you want this ratio to be. So again, you've got to understand the ratio, but once you understand it, it can point to good things here. Debt service coverage, this one I don't know that we need a lot of explanation on. It's a pretty standard ratio that most of you see in various industries. You're basically just trying to see operating earnings, are they able to cover debt, and how much of a cushion is provided by your operations compared to what you're doing with debt. We typically share 2 different ways of calculating this. And if you see the blue bar, that's going to be the strategic financial analysis way of calculating it. The yellow bar is the Moody's method of calculating it. Now, you'll notice the trend seems to be similar, but they obviously aren't the same number. And the reason for that is Moody's has some smoothing type things that they do. They don't just take your numbers when they calculate this ratio. One example of a change that they do is they ignore your spending policy, and they say, let's assume you do 5% over a 3-year average. That's just what we're going to assume, 5% of your cash and investment balance. So and they make some other modifications as well. So again, you just kind of have to understand that those are different, but you can still see that the trend is typically following pretty much the same trend. It's just a different number.
And one other thing about these debt ratios, we have 3 up here, but keep in mind that this one and the previous one, the debt burden, are more from an affordability standpoint. Can you pay for the debt that you have? The viability obviously is a capacity. And a lot of times, some institutions might have capacity, but the debt service coverage ratio especially shows that they really don't have the ability to service the debt once they get it. And vice versa, some institutions that are highly leveraged might not have any capacity based on the viability ratio, but they might have the affordability. They might be able to service the debt based on these particular ratios. So it's good to look at them in conjunction, both from the balance sheet side and also from the statement of activity side.
And I think that's an important point John's making there, because if you go back into telling your story, based on what we're seeing here, this is not a good example because they're kind of hitting everything on all 8 cylinders in these ratios. But let's say these affordability ratios didn't look as good, but the viability ratio still looked pretty good. If you go into a discussion with someone where you're trying to maybe incur some additional debt and all you're talking about is your balance sheet stream, well, that's pretty clear. You've got that. What you're going to have to be able to explain is the servicing of it, because when they run ratios, they're going to say, well, that's great that you've got a solid balance sheet, but how are you going to pay us back? And so again, using the ratios to see what is this outside party going to see what's the story they're going to see, and how am I going to be prepared to discuss it and to explain what we plan on doing. Asset performance. You know, there's one huge one that's nice and simple, return on net assets. You know, we'll look at that one, another one of the components of the CFI. And then we've got two there that I like to talk about typically when I talk with boards, because they can really tell a story if you use those two ratios together. And so if we start with return on net assets, overall measurement, we typically use an average of your net assets. You could also use beginning. You would just want to be consistent so it doesn't look like you're telling a different story, but to kind of smooth out some of the fluctuations, we typically use average net assets based on this calculation. The recommended level, 3 to 4% plus some form of inflation index. We typically use the Higher Education Price Index that's put out by Common Fund. And so again, you look at a trend here and you start seeing this pattern of what's been going on at this institution, right? Because you see the same trend going down and then a huge jump. John already said, based on what he was seeing, it looked like investment returns must have really been good in a year. Well, that would also feed this, you know. So that's your total change in net assets. It's going to have permanently restricted endowment type gifts. All of that in this is total change in net assets. And so you can see they're well above that particular year, well above the minimum advisables and things like that. Now, these two that I want to talk about the physical reinvestment first. This ratio is designed to determine whether or not you're incurring capital expenditures sufficient to keep up with depreciation in your plan. It's kind of designed to help be an indicator of potential deferred maintenance type thing. So the calculation, you look at your capital expenditures, what did you replace versus your annual depreciation expense. If you had a number of 1, that theoretically means you're replacing as fast as you're depreciating. That makes sense, right? So that's what you would want to look at. So, but you don't know the whole story yet until we talk about the next ratio. So this is that one. So if you look at where they are, what's the story? They're incurring some capital expenditures here, right? They're spending more than their depreciation. They're doing some campus stuff, is what you're seeing on here. Again, don't know who they are, never set foot on their campus, but you can see from this ratio, they're doing some stuff. They're trying to replace some assets. You combine that with this ratio, which is just looking at your total accumulated depreciation by your annual depreciation expense. And if you think about how the math works there, as your assets age, the accumulated depreciation is building. You have some assets that may be fully depreciated now, so your depreciation expense starts to decrease. So if that number starts growing, theoretically, it's going to point to you have an aging plant. So an individual that's looking at your numbers may not have even set the first step on your campus. They run a ratio and they think, ooh, looks like they've got an old plant. Your facilities may be great. You've kept up with them, but the perception isn't going to be that. So what I was saying, you use these together is you would say, okay, minimum is recommended to be at that 14 or less. They're sitting right there at it. So this would look like, okay, there doesn't appear to be deferred maintenance. Plus, we saw in that other ratio that they're out there incurring expenditures. They're replacing plant. So without stepping on the campus, these folks would look at this and they would think, hey, we've got an institution that I don't expect I'm going to see deferred maintenance. It looks like they're more than keeping up with it, and their plant isn't old. Does that make sense when you put those two together? This ratio became very helpful, those two, once presenting to a board, and walked into the meeting, and it was very clear there were two camps. One side of the room, they literally had sat on different sides of the room. I walk into this room. This side clearly wanted to grow the endowment. This side clearly wanted to incur some plant expenditures, because you typically can't do both. If you're going to go to your big donors, you're either asking for, I need to build a building, or you're asking for some endowment money. You typically can't get both there. Clearly two separate camps. When we started looking at the ratios, I told them I'm an auditor, I can't advise you on that, but let's look at what the numbers are showing. Well, their age of facilities was, I think, around 20 or something. It was way up there. Their plant amounts that they were incurring were below 1. I said, people looking at it, it looks like you've got an aging plant. And then there are other factors. You have students that would come, but they don't because your facilities look old. It led to a discussion for them to ultimately make their decision. They landed on building a new facility, which led to enrollment increase. It worked. They used it to go through their strategic plan and decide where do we need to focus. And so that's the important part about using these ratios sometimes. It doesn't change the numbers, but it can kind of put them in a perspective that helps you understand what's going on, based on the numbers here. All right, John loved this poll question. You got two options.
Still Christmas movie.
Is no one, they're just not going to vote. No, I'm just kidding. Those are two clear options. It's simple, one or the other, Just the National League. Okay, I'll still accept that. Still better than your Reds, according to them.
True. True.
All right. Well, it's still ticking up a little bit there. If I wait long enough, I might get to 20%. No, I'll go ahead and go. All right. Finally, just your operating results. Net income ratio and then student revenue dependency are two things that we typically like to look at when it comes to your campus. Your net income ratio is just going to look at your operating measure, and that's defined as looking at your unrestricted net assets just from the operating side. So leave out endowment earnings and things that aren't available for operations, leave out longer term gifts that you've chosen to put below the line, those types of things, your operating measure, compared to the total unrestricted or without donor restrictions that is coming in your revenue. Minimum advisable 2 to 4. So this would be an area that if you were again looking strategically, you would say, oh, well, okay, now we found an area to concentrate on. We're looking at the operations of the institution. Clearly their endowment was performing well, investments have performed well, looks good as far as their financial ability to cover debt, all those types of things. Now we're looking at operations, we're saying, okay, there's somewhere we can concentrate on and maybe focus. Student-driven revenue, we kind of heard about that during President Bushman's comments and throughout the day about this being an important number. It's looking at your net tuition and fees and your auxiliary revenues. Those are the revenues that are coming from your students. And there's a recommended level, again, by the Strategic Financial Analysis Group to say, you'd want that ideally to be less than 75%, which would mean 25% of your income is coming from other sources, other than just being dependent upon students. This is a pretty typical chart of our client base with the higher education clients. Again, you can see this drop, and we've already talked about what that's going to be when you had that 1 year of some additional investment returns, especially you have unrestricted investment returns that you're using in operations, those types of things. But that's kind of what we see typically is, I think the median of our group is just over 80 maybe. Is that right, John? Is that what you remember? 82-ish or something like that, I think is the median of our group typically. And you can kind of see that's kind of a norm for small private colleges and universities. But is it something you could focus on and try to work on? Yes. We heard about revenue diversification earlier. You may not be able to totally diversify out of student-driven revenues. What we're seeing a lot of our clients doing is diversifying within student revenues. They've ran that they can do that. So it's new programs, it's new going more into graduate programs. One institution we worked with a number of years ago, they were less than 10%. They're now 35, 40% graduate. It's a definite change has happened there as far as what they're doing and who they are.
Go to the next slide.
The next slide after this one?
Yeah, after this one. After the composite financial ordinance. So one of the ones that we probably should have pulled up that I like, and I don't know how many people here like it, but it's basically comparing the net tuition per student versus the educational expenses per student. And what's the gap between those two numbers? The educational expenses per student that we use that's included here is just the operating expenses less the auxiliary expenses divided by the FTEs. But this is a good barometer. Do any institutions actually track the difference between the net tuition per student and the educational expenses per student, or some manner of educational expenses per student, just to see what the difference is? It's interesting because there's always going to be a gap. In this particular institution, the blue bar is actually the net tuition per student, $10,000, almost $11,000. But the educational expenses are $24,000. So there's $13,000 there that has to be made up from something, endowment spending, annual funds and other sources, but they'll never be the same. For the institutions in this room, they will never be the same. But it's nice to, I mean, it would be nice to be able to track that to see, does it grow? Does it shrink? And if it shrinks, where do you want it to be? How close do you want it to be? Again, it's probably, in a perfect world, it would never be zero just because of the way schools operate. But it's just an interesting dynamic, and one that I don't think that a lot of our institutions actually put the two together. We provide both of these ratios, but as far as putting them together to see what the difference between the two would be, usually doesn't happen. And I think that probably would be something good to track, just to see, is that growing? Is the gap growing, or is it coming together? I had one institution in particular that a board member was a former partner at a Big Four CPA firm, and he was always hammering management about this institution, to the point where the CFO told him to go get a real job. He was retired, but the CFO said, please, Ralph, go get a job. But this was one of the big things that he hit on, and it was, you know, he always had interesting comments about this. But anyhow, that was, I think, the final operational ratio that we wanted to talk about.
And then this we'll just do real quickly. I kept mentioning core financial core ratio to the CFI. This is a single ratio that's meant to measure the financial health of an organization long term. You can see 70% of that ratio is based on the strength of your expendable net assets as compared to your balance sheet and as compared to your operating expenses. And it's intended to be that way. You know, the last two, only 30%, are more the current year statement of activities. One is just operations, the other is total change. And obviously there's a reason for that. If we're looking at not what's happening in the immediate term, we're looking long term and saying, what's the financial strength here? That's why it's weighted towards those. What that also does is that same pattern you'll see with the CFI. If investment markets and other things aren't performing as well, you'll see this, and then you see a good year in investment markets, you're going to see that big jump. You know, so it will still have some fluctuations, but again, you can explain it, you know what it is. But the recommended level on this thing, as you can see over here, is a 3 to a 4. So we use the average midpoint 3.5 and just kind of compare that. So you can see their 5-year average is a 4.31. So anyone outside looking at these ratios, whether that be your accreditation body, whomever it may be, what they're going to see is, okay, it looks like they're in a financially healthy position based on what we're seeing here. There doesn't seem to be any issues with that. Anything else on that one, John?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so I think that is the last slide. So we will take any questions that anyone may have. That's why John's here, to handle any tough questions that may come about.
I'm here to keep you on schedule because it's.
Is it time? Questions?
Any questions at all? If not, we'll be here at dinner too. So.
We'll be here, so you can always grab us and talk to us there. But otherwise, thank you very much for being here with us for the first day of our finally back in person after 2 years of having to be either virtual or not having it. Look forward to seeing all those that stay for dinner, and look forward to seeing you again tomorrow morning.